Okay, my name is Paul Woolever. The name of my company is Pinellas Power Products. This particular video is going to cover how to change out the starter motor without having to remove the heat shield or the exhaust manifold or the intake manifold or any of the other stuff, so that it just makes changing the starter a whole lot quicker and easier. And this was requested by Providence Oil out of Assiniboia, Saskatchewan in Canada. He told me that it's apparently 50 degrees below zero where he is right now. First thing you're going to need to do is remove this end cover. The top screw goes in this hole, and these two top screws should be the chrome-plated Phillips head screws. And that's the only 3 chrome-plated Phillips head screws in the generator. On the front, you'll have 2. Fortunately, this generator is nicely corroded because it's from up north also. You have 2 6x10 bolts. They'll need to be removed all the way, holding this outer cover on. The top bolt is a shouldered bolt, and it uses a shallow shoulder. And all the bolts in this fiberglass cover use the shallow shoulder. There are only 3 bolts in the entire generator that use this deeper shoulder. This would be the deep shoulder. And if you put these in this fiberglass cover in accidentally, the shoulder is too long and it never tightens down on the cover. Those bolts are supposed to go here, here, through the grommet, and then one down behind the water bottle. So if you find that you've got the deep shoulder bolts in this cover, it's in the wrong spot. Then you have one bolt that comes out right here, and it's the same as the 2 in the front, the 6x10. There are 2 more of the 6x10 bolts down at the very bottom. And these 2 don't have to come all the way out. They can just be loosened up about 3 to 4 turns, because the metal bracket that this cover slides onto is slotted. With all the corrosion on this generator, I'm going to have to loosen it up just a little bit more there. When you've got this cover off, it's a good time to go ahead and check the water pump and the timing belt and whatever kind of bug that is. But the water pump itself, the earliest indication you will get is the teeth on the water pump. And if you notice, these teeth are nice and straight across. There's not a groove worn into them. Shortly after you get a deep groove worn into this pump, it'll start leaking at the pee hole, which is pretty common on water pumps if you've ever changed them on a car. next step is going to be to remove the ignition coil. Set that out of the way. Then we'll remove the flywheel. On the flywheels, about 80% of the time you can get away with backing the nut off to where it's just dead even with the end of the crank, and then putting a pry bar behind it to put a little bit of tension. And what I do is go right by the starter bolts and put just a little bit of tension on the backside of the flywheel and hit it with an impact gun, and that flywheel will pop loose. If it does not pop loose, you're going to have to remove these 3 bolts and use a harmonic balancer puller into those 3 holes. Okay, this one came off. Like I said earlier, at least 80% of them will come off this way. Next, you'll need to remove the ignition coil holding bracket. It's held on with 3 screws. Another one of those bugs. Apparently they're pretty popular in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure what they are. We don't have that here in Florida. Let me take a moment to go over these bolts. You notice there are 2 longer bolts and 1 short bolt. And this is a little bit counterintuitive. There are 2 dowel pins on this bracket. The dowel pins will be in the 5 o'clock position and the 11 o'clock position. One without a dowel pin is down here in the 7 o'clock position. Ironically, the shorter bolt goes in the 11 o'clock position. This hole does not go very deep. I know it's counterintuitive that the dowel pin would require the shorter bolt. But you put the short bolt in the 11 o'clock position, the long bolt in the 5 o'clock, and in the 7 o'clock positions. Okay, next we're going to remove the bracket for the radiator. The radiator is held on with 2 bolts. And these bolts are identical to the bolts that held the ignition coil to the ignition coil bracket. They are interchangeable. The next bracket for the radiator, or bolt for the radiator, goes straight in from the top here. Then there's a temperature sensor on the top of the radiator here. one orange wire, one yellow wire. You'll need to unplug that and create just a little bit of slack in those wires. Just push them back into the loom. Then on this end of the radiator, there'll be the wiring harness for the cooling fan. Unplug that. Feed the cooling fan harness straight up out of the top. And that way, your radiator is completely unbolted. At this point, you can take the radiator and lift up on it. It'll be a little bit sticky. Here are two saddles that the radiator sits in. Do not lose those. Okay. At this end, there's a radiator mount bracket that'll need to be removed. You'll notice what I did was I just simply sat the radiator to where the shroud is held up by the end bracket. You do not have to remove the hoses or anything from the radiator. Where it's at right now is sufficiently far enough out of the way for you to sneak in there and get that cooling fan out. What I'm going to do now is remove the radiator mount bracket that's right behind the starter motor. And it's held on with two nuts, 10mm nuts. Slide this out of the way. And here's the bracket. We'll set the bracket out of the way. You can see into the back of this now. You can actually see the back of the starter motor. Can you get a light on that? I don't know if that's enough light or... There's a flashlight here too. There's the heavy wire straight from the battery post, and then the gray wire that plugs into the solenoid. So what we'll do is simply unplug the gray wire. It's a spade terminal. Sometimes they're corroded really bad and you got to get a pair of pliers on there to pull. The nut on this is a 12mm. Pull the boot out of the way. Just push it up. And there's your 12mm nut. The way I do it is simply a 3/8 ratchet with a long extension so that I can get at it straight in from under the radiator. Like I say, I've got the battery removed from this generator because this wire would be live if I did not. Remove the wire and don't lose the lock nut or lock washer. So that's the wiring out of the way now. Okay, let's go ahead and take a break for a moment. Okay, the next part of the job is going to be to remove this motor mount. First, there are two small screws, bolts, that hold this flange to this engine mount. If your generator was made previous to 1995, these bolts will have a 10mm head on them. If it was made after that, they'll have the 8mm head on them. This generator has the 8mm heads. Don't let yourself be too concerned, but keep these two bolts separate from the ones that go into the outer shield. If you have the 10mm heads, that go into here, they have no flange on them. The ones that go here have a flange on them. And the reason is, when the flywheel is set in place, the ring gear runs right across the head of these bolts, so they need them to be a very low profile head. And you notice the 8mm ones have a very low profile, and so do the 10mm ones without a flange. In fact, here's one of the 10mm ones with no flange. Whereas here's the 10mm bolt that went into the outer cover. You see the difference. Whatever you do, don't mix those up. Now we're going to take this engine mount off. There's a ground strap that's held in place with a 12mm nut. We just put the nut back on loosely here. Because we're removing the motor mount, the whole engine is going to sag. Put something under it. If you've got something wide and flat, you can slide that under it. That way this corner of the generator won't drop when you remove the engine mount. You can use a screwdriver or a piece of wood or whatever you happen to have. Now these two bolts hold the starter motor into this bracket. When I got one this badly corroded, I'm going to remove these bolts completely, because this generator has considerable amount of corrosion on it. And these bolts I'm going to put with the two smaller ones that came out of there. Then I'm going to put in two, I guess I'll call them sacrificial bolts, that are longer, that I can screw into the starter. Then I'm going to take a brass hammer and just hit on the end of the bolt head to try and drive the starter out of this motor mount. Starting to move out. However, it's rocking ever so slightly. This portion is staying in, this portion is coming out. So I'm going to put a pry bar under this side to just try and pull it back straight. Okay, it's starting to move. It moved. So now you can see that the starter motor is disengaged in there. If you have a brass hammer to drive these bolts back, use a brass hammer instead of a steel hammer. If you do use a brass hammer, your sacrificial bolts will not get destroyed. If you don't have a brass hammer, just go ahead and use the steel one and use sacrificial bolts. It's just some things happen that way. Then go ahead and remove these bolts the rest of the way. These bolts are the shortest of the 8mm bolts that you'll be removing. The medium length bolts go here and here, which hold the starter to the bracket. And now the longest two hold the bracket to the engine block. And they're the longest because they go through some dowel pins. Because the alignment for this bracket to the engine block is critical, because that's what controls the depth between the starter drive gear and the ring gear on the flywheel. And now what we need to do is just gently wiggle this bracket off of these two dowel pins. The cover, as you can clearly see, will flex quite a bit. And it'll flex just enough for us to push the starter backward and slide this bracket out this way, about 6 millimeters, and in this way. All I'm doing is just wiggling this bracket off of here. Don't go getting in too much of a hurry. Let me take a break for a minute. Okay, this is kind of a compromise between being able to get in there and do this and having enough light on it and so forth for him to be able to videotape it. Basically all we're doing is just wiggling this bracket loose. Okay, I've got the top dowel off. What I've done is we simply pulled these two dowels out of the engine block right here. We slid them this way and then slid the bracket out. So now you have a nasty looking mount bracket. Put that apart from your sink for now. And now, for anybody who doubted that this would work, here is the starter motor. This is an early style starter. Let me show you the difference real quick. I'll get a new style. Like I say, this is the really early one, which ironically these almost never broke. This is the new style. You'll recognize the difference primarily is in the end barrel. This one is just a thin plate of metal that is pressed and stamped. This one, the whole end casing on the generator or on the starter motor comes off. This one, if you're starting to get a whining sound, sometimes you can replace just the end bearing and be good to go again. That's the earliest that you can catch them, is if you just, every now and then, you press the button and the starter doesn't want to engage correctly, but you hear a faint whine in the background. Replace that bearing and you'll be good again. If you let it go, you'll wind up having to replace the whole starter. Let's go ahead and take a break for a moment. Okay. At this point, you would be ready to put either a new starter motor back in or a rebuilt starter motor back in or whatever. Like I stated earlier, this video was specifically so that Mr. Johnson from Providence Oil could see how to go about changing the starters. So I'm going to put the original starter right back in this one. Like I say, these older ones, number one, don't break, and number two, the whole purpose of this video is not to switch the starter out in this generator, but simply to show how it's done if you have a generator that needs it. So just set the starter motor back in here and set it far enough back that it won't interfere with you. Take the bracket and make sure that the dowel pins are either still attached to the bracket or still embedded in the block. It really doesn't matter where they are, as long as they are around these two bolts. Set this bracket. This foot and this foot go behind this portion of the engine frame. This foot goes outboard of it. Slide the bracket back into place. The top dowel is lined up, so I'm going to put a bolt through that one. I'm not going to tighten it down yet, just give it a couple of turns, and then maneuver the bottom one into place. Okay, you'll be able to feel it clunk into place when the second bolt goes. Incidentally, if you are changing a starter motor or anything like that, this is a good time to also inspect the cam seal and see if it's leaking. It's real easy to tell if a cam seal is leaking. Just shine a flashlight in to one of the holes. On this one here, you can tell it's as dry as a bone. Incidentally, most of this oil that's on this engine was penetrating oil that I sprayed on it before we started shooting the video, because this thing is a lump of corrosion, and I'm shooting this video on rather short notice, because the gentleman that needs it now. But most of the oil that's on here is penetrating oil, so that I could get the bolts out, just to demonstrate this procedure for him. At any rate, tighten the bolts that go from the bracket to the engine block. Then put the two shortest bolts, and those will be the ones that go from the bracket to the main frame. The bottom holes on the brackets are slotted, so put a pry bar under it and raise up on it slightly. When you change the motor mounts, all four motor mounts on these, and if you get in close here, you can see that the bolt is slotted top to bottom. So now that you can see the top of the gap sticking out above the bolt, and on this one here, when I tighten it down, you'll be able to see the top of the gap above the flange on the bolt. And that way, the engine of the generator doesn't drop against the pan. Boy, that ground's a long way down. Then we're going to put the ground strap back in place. When you put the ground strap on, fold it down to where it stays low, because otherwise the plastic cover that goes in here will rub against it and make it difficult on you. I usually try to keep them turned down like that. It's not a major issue, it just makes life a little bit easier for you when you get to the next step. Then, I'm going to put the two 8mm bolts, 6mm bolts with 8mm heads in this particular case. Just hold that metal shield to the engine mount and starter motor mount bracket. Then we'll take the two bolts that came out of the starter motor. Take the starter motor, close that door. Again, I'm going to start these loosely. And provided that you're working with a clean motor, that starter will pull straight in. This one is all corroded. It's going to need a lot of work in the future. But we'll get this video done now. And just tighten the bolts one at a time, just back and forth, just drawing that starter motor in where it needs to sit. Don't tighten one bolt down all the way, or the starter motor will wedge in at a slight angle, and then you got your work cut out for you, getting the starter unjammed and ready to pull back in where it needs to be. So that's all the starter motor bolts right there. Then you can go ahead and slide your shim out from under the the generator. At this point, you're ready to put the ignition coil bracket back in place. Like I pointed out earlier, make sure that the two dowel pins are there, because if the dowel pins are not in place, this can move ever so slightly. It will not allow the ignition timing to change drastically, but if it slides down, it will allow the ignition coil to hit the flywheel. Okay, once again, the bolt in the 5 o'clock position is one of the longer ones. The one that goes in the 11 o'clock position is the short bolt. And the one that goes in the 7 o'clock position is again one of the longer ones. You'll notice that the bolts that hold the ignition bracket on are tapered just slightly because they're going into blind holes. So the one that holds the black bracket in place, or the ones that hold the bracket in place, have that slight taper to them. The ones that hold the coil on have a normal end, and they are the same as the ones that held the radiator. But go ahead and snug this in place. If you wanted a torque spec on it, it would be 10 Newton meters. Go ahead and put the flywheel back in place. And put the ignition coil back in place. Now be careful when you put the coil on. Just barely snug it. And then you'll have to spin the flywheel. Make sure that the magnet on the flywheel does not actually contact the coil. I start with 10/100ths of a millimeter as a gap. I know that's pretty tight. I like them as tight as you can get without actually touching. And you notice that's measured at the magnet. These things, the magnet usually sticks out just slightly further than the base of the flywheel. And now we hope it didn't shift on me when I tighten down the bolts. Okay, you spin it back and forth, you just listen very carefully for any contacts, or you look and make sure there are no rub marks. The next step will be to go back, put our wiring back in place. And on the end of the starter motor is the main heavy wire. We're just going to push the boot out of the way so we can actually work in place. Put the ring terminal over the end of the stud and put the lock washer on the stud and the nut in place. Now if you're looking at it directly from the end, you want the wire to come down to the stud on the back of the motor And don't rotate too far over, because then you won't be able to get the boot in place. You want the wire to come down almost the 11 o'clock position, or at 11 o'clock angle to the stud. And that way it'll give you enough room to put that boot in place. And this is a 12mm nut again. We're just going to take the boot and push it back in place. And if you did not leave enough gap, this will be difficult. That's why I like to put the wire running down there at about an 11 o'clock angle. Okay, and then we'll take the gray wire with the spade terminal and put it back on the terminal coming out of the back of the starter. It's important to make sure that you do get this spade terminal pushed all the way on. And then get the boot in place. Because ironically, if you don't, sure enough, you'll get corrosion in here. And then it's going to have a poor contact, and your starter will not work right. Sometimes they work easy on, and sometimes they don't. Because we're filming this one, it's being a pain. Okay, now if you come around that end, you can see how it goes in there. And this boot right here is the one that was fighting for so long. The wire is just a simple spade terminal. It goes on the back of the starter motor. At this point, take the bracket for the radiator, and this side faces the radiator, this side faces the starter motor. Slide it back over the two studs. Put the two nuts in place. Tighten it down. Once you get that tightened down, take the two saddle mounts, set them in place on the frame, and these 2 feet on the radiator go into those saddle mounts. So what we're going to do is take the radiator, lower it back down into place. Be careful, don't pinch the wires that went to the temperature sensor or the wires that went to the cooling fan. Okay. These are the 2 bolts that held it on. They're identical to the 2 bolts that hold the ignition coil itself. Not the ignition coil bracket, but the coil held to the bracket. Put your temperature sensor wiring harness back on. It does not matter which wire goes in which location. All this is an on-off switch. When the coolant in the radiator exceeds 220 degrees, it shuts the engine off. That's the purpose of this. Incidentally, the fans in these run all the time. This coolant temperature sensor shuts it off when the radiator temperature exceeds 220. Let's go ahead and take a break. Okay, incidentally, when I was tightening down the 2 10mm bolts with 8mm heads, I don't remember if I said that the torque on that should be 10 kilograms per meter or 10 newton meters. It would be 10 newton meters. Incidentally, the flywheel torque is 113 newton meters, which is about 80 foot-pounds of torque. And I set the air gap at the tightest point, which on this flywheel happened to be the magnet. I set it at 1/10 of a millimeter. Honda says set it at 2/10. So if you want to have a bigger margin of error, if you're concerned you're a little tight, then go with 2/10 of a millimeter, and you should be good. The next step would be to go ahead and put this cover back on. Loosen up the bottom 2 bolts to where you've got enough of a gap to slide it into the slot on the housing. It is a little trickier to put it back on than it is to take it off. Typically the way it works, things don't have to line up when you're taking them apart. Over here there's a grommet for the spark plug leads that slide into this slot. Just watch that when you slide this cover on. Oop, it jumped out of track on me. We get to start over again. Before you start tightening anything down, just check to make sure that the grommet for the spark plugs is in place correctly. This time it is. When I put these together, put these bolts in first, and only because it makes your life easier. bolt will go in the top here in the back. The chrome-plated screw goes into the top. Then you'd come back and tighten down the two bottom bolts. And this is why I strongly recommend not taking the bottom bolts all the way out, just loosening them and taking advantage of the fact that that cover is slotted. Makes it a lot easier to get it back together again. Okay. Then you'd come around to this end, take the plug from the cooling fan motor, feed it back into place, plug your cooling fan back in, then just go around and make sure that there's no wires pinched or anything else. At this point, you would be taking the generator and test starting it. I'm not going to be starting it up because this generator does not run. That's the whole reason why it was shipped here, is to fix it and repair the running problem. But I was able to use it to demonstrate the replacement of the starter technique. That should do it.